It's a place like nowhere else. Steeper, colder, deadlier.
Sort of blew my life apart.
A mountain that gives.
It's the first prize in mountaineering and, dare I say, possibly the hardest mountain in the world.
That takes.
Al Rouse is one of Britain's most dynamic Himalayan climbers.
That doesn't let go.
It was like the mountain was gesturing to us, like, come on, and I'll get you too. I mean, it makes me shudder now to think of it.
Where achieving your goal can cost you your life, and every move is a calculated risk.
It doesn't matter how good you are, how famous you are, whether you're the finest rock climber in the world, if you make a mistake, you'll die.
The world's deadliest mountain, K2 on Most Deadly. Mountain ranges project a fearsome power. For most of history, summit regions were thought to belong more to heaven than earth, and people stayed away. It's only in the past century that climbing the world's highest peaks has even been attempted. For Peter Hillary, mountain climbing is a passion and a birthright. He is the son of Sir Edmund Hillary, the man who made the first summit of Mount Everest in 1953. Risk and adventure have been a guiding force in his life since childhood.
It's chemistry, basically. Some of us just love to go out to these places. We feel really drawn to it. But the thing about fear is fear, I believe, makes you careful and it makes you good. If you don't have a bit of fear, a bit of tension, a bit of anxiety in your life, I'm not sure I'd bother doing anything. That's one of the things that draws me to mountaineering, because you know that your decisions really matter.
For those who climb, the Himalayan chain in Southeast Asia holds unique allure. Its soaring peaks testify to the violent forces that formed it.
The reason that the Himalaya are so unusual is that it is a continent-continent collision. For a long time, it was a collision between an ocean and a continent. But 50 million years ago, India collided finally with Asia. You can't push continent deep into the Earth mantle, and so the collisional process has nowhere to go but up.
At just over 29,000 feet, Mount Everest tops the Himalayas. And for Peter Hillary, it represents great personal triumph. Twice he's gazed out from its summit and taken in the world. But while there's no higher peak on Earth, for Hillary and so many others, another now dominates the imagination. It's K2, the second mountain in the Himalayas' remote Karakoram range. Standing at over 28,250 feet, the land it occupies in northern Pakistan is so isolated that until the late 19th century, it went without a name. Only Everest stands taller. But while thousands have conquered that mountain, the number of climbers to summit K2 is fewer than 250. Getting to K2 from North America is an endurance test in and of itself. A 16-hour plane trip to Islamabad is followed by an 18-hour bus ride. 7 more hours in a Jeep leads you to rugged glacial wasteland that must be crossed by foot. It is only after a full 40-hour trek up rocky fields of ice and snow that K2 can even be glimpsed, but the reward is rich.
I mean, it takes your breath away. This great, strong pyramid that stands away from the rest of the peaks of the Karakoram. And it doesn't matter who you are, when you see a mountain like that, you think, wow, this is a serious hill.
The great thing about the Himalaya in Tibet, the Karakoram region, of course, is that the lowest part of the plateau there is at 15,000 feet, or everywhere higher than the highest mountains in the Rockies.
Final trek to K2 travels the Baltoro Glacier to Concordia, often called the throne room of mountain gods.
Once you get there, the challenges of climbing this awful mountain are quite formidable. Steep slopes, avalanches all the time. It's a mountain that has its sort of own defenses, if you like. The incoming monsoons rise there and dump their load. before the snow gets onto the Tibetan Plateau.
Monsoon-driven snowfalls make slopes of icy rock treacherously unstable. At any given time, avalanches can be seen running down its flanks in all directions. And the geological features of K2 are punishing. Rising over 9,000 feet in less than 2.5 miles, the vertical scale of the mountain is unsurpassed. Climbers taking the favored southeastern route known as the Abruzzi Ridge trek up 3,000 feet of avalanche debris, leading to a 200-foot vertical ice-choked crack known as House's Chimney that must be ascended just before Camp 2. The next day, climbers are confronted with the Black Pyramid, over 1,300 feet of near vertical rock and ice, a sheer mountain face as ominous as the name suggests.
So you've got the Black Pyramid, which is 2,000 feet of mixed rock and ice, including a couple of quite decent overhangs, before you get onto the final snow slopes that lead up onto the shoulder of K2.
But while the shoulder represents a drop in incline, at 25,000 feet above sea level, it's also an area prone to avalanches and extremely high winds. Climbers cross, praying that snow won't collapse underneath them before making it to final camp beneath the summit. Another full day's climb ahead.
The weather conditions and the winds it's a whole different ballpark up there at high altitude. Well, I mean, sometimes you'd hear bang, bang, coming down the face, and you'd look up and you just see these big boulders the size of a man's head, and they just bound from side to side, and you'd look like this. And you know, I mean, you just don't know where they're going to go.
Advancing on the shoulder, the mountain heads above 8,000 meters, or 26,000 feet, an altitude so lacking in oxygen that to climbers, it's become known as the death zone.
No one thrives at the top of any of these big mountains. We have a fraction of the oxygen available for our bodies to exercise and for the brain to work. Day by day, you get less and less strong, less and less clear-headed, less and less able to take care of yourself.
British climber Alan Hinks is one of 13 mountaineers in the world to have climbed all 14 peaks above 8,000 meters or 26,000 feet.
Imagine you've got flu and you're suffering from a hangover and got a horrendous headache, and you're trying to run a marathon in a, let's say with a lot of heavy clothes on in a heat wave. Put a carry bag over your head as well so you can hardly breathe. A bit like that. It's pretty uncomfortable trying to climb an 8,000er. It's a survival exercise.
At the highest altitudes, climbers on any mountain are vulnerable to acute mountain sickness or hypoxia caused by extreme oxygen deprivation and exhaustion.
If we took 10 people and went to 26,000 or higher, at 20 to 30 minutes, unless we had a very unusual human being, most of them would be unconscious. And if they didn't descend, they would die in an hour or two.
On K2, the combination of thin air, changing weather, and difficult terrain make the regions above the clouds uniquely threatening, even for the most fit and experienced climbers. At these killing altitudes, final ascents still lay ahead on K2. From Camp 4, beyond the shoulder, the summit is a solid 12 to 20 hours away. Getting there means conquering the bottleneck, a 328-foot ice-enameled gully. At over 27,000 feet, the bottleneck lies squarely in the death zone. Windswept and frigid, this feature has claimed the lives of at least 10 climbers, 5% of all who've tried. Even for those who do make summit, triumph on K2 holds one more mysterious danger. The euphoria of reaching the top can turn ordinary mountain sickness into a deadly case of summit fever, where lack of judgment contributes greatly to loss of life.
When we talk about the uniqueness of people's responses to high altitude, it's what we call the $64,000 question. It's about this balance of judgment versus desire to attain a certain goal. and the right decision is always the one that allows everyone to get back to camp safely.
The summit is a very dangerous place because psychologically people have a tendency to go, we've done it, and their discipline, their focus often lapses with their exhaustion on the way down, and too often there are terrible mistakes.
It took Alan Hinks 3 tries to conquer K2. He finally made it on July 17, 1995.
When I got to the top, it was almost like I was in a dream. Normally, you would only spend 5 minutes on an 8,000er. I must have spent about 40 minutes on the summit. I just couldn't move. It was like the summit was made of porridge and I was glued to it.
Well, I've done it. I'm here on top of K2. This is great. I'm just going to get back down. I've got to survive the descent. Alan Hinks on top of K2. Pakistan.
I did spend too long on the top of K2. And why did I do that? It was just because I'd spent 3 years of my life trying to climb it. It was this mountain I needed to climb. I wanted to climb, you know, the hardest mountain in the world. It was a challenge for me and a release, and I didn't want to just go at the top for 5 minutes and get the heck out of there.
Alan Hinks took his extended moment on the summit of K2 and safely descended. But his experience there sounds a cautionary note
that echoes through the mountain's history.
On K2, there simply is no margin for error.
It doesn't matter how good you are, how famous you are, whether you're the finest rock climber in the world, if you make a mistake, you'll die.
Leading up to Hinks' summit in 1995, the mid-1980s presented a staggering ratio of deaths on K2. 1 in 6 climbers would never return from the mountain's peak altitudes. And then came the summer of 1986, when more people died on K2 in one single season than in all the previous years combined. K2, the world's deadliest mountain. Those who climb the tallest mountains are a breed apart, bound by the extraordinary worlds they alone have seen atop the highest peaks and deep within themselves. Some share a darker bond as well, the kind that forms in the crucible of tragedy, failure, and death. In a single summer not so long ago, the mystique surrounding K2 would take a terrible turn.
20 years ago to next month. Yeah. Tragic, isn't it?
It sort of blew my life apart.
Jim Curran was a climber and filmmaker back then. He had come to K2 as part of a British expedition led by renowned mountaineer Alan Rouse.
Al Rouse was one of Britain's sort of most dynamic younger Himalayan climbers. I suppose I was his best friend. We climbed together, went out to the pub together, discussed all our various life's vicissitudes. He was a bit younger than me, and I think he saw me as some sort of senile old uncle figure, but we were very close.
Curran was to film the ascent of Rouse's British team along a route that had never been successfully climbed before. While their assignment was unique, they were hardly alone in their mission to summit the mountain. In that summer of 1986, 9 elite teams from 8 different countries decided that K2 was the place to be. The atmosphere was electric.
To begin with, it was quite exciting. We knew quite a lot of people off other expeditions. There were different camps set up this glacial moraine, which we call the Strip. And it was all very sort of light-hearted and holiday-ish to begin with.
Each team's route had been designated by the Pakistani authorities. Several were assigned the Abruzzi Ridge, a technically hazardous route, but one that yielded the highest rate of success. Alan Rouse and the British group are to go up along the Northwest Route, a sweeping ridge running from 17,000 feet to the summit, notorious for bad weather and yet to be successfully ascended.
Everyone was very ambitious and pretty single-minded about their own expedition. The weather settled into a pattern that never really changed for the rest of the summer, and this would involve 3 or 4 days of quite fine weather that would then break down. You then have maybe a week of storms and then another few days. And the problem for us was knowing when to start, because we wanted to get high on the mountain to the best of the weather, so it quite often meant leaving base camp while it was still bad.
It wouldn't take long for the random fury of K2 to assert itself. On June 21st, under clear skies, a monumental sheet of ice breaks from the mountainside, bearing 2 Americans. The good weather of the previous few days had caused the frozen slope to destabilize. On K2, even good weather creates lethal situations.
I don't think anyone expected that. And actually the scar it made, you see this enormous sort of stepped edge where this great layer of snow had carved off. And of course anyone on it or below it didn't stand a chance.
On June 23rd, 6 climbers working without oxygen achieved summit, including Wanda Rukiewicz from Poland and husband and wife Liliane and Maurice Berard from France. Wanda and Liliane make history for being the first women to the top of K2.
It was sheer ecstasy to be on the summit. I remember Liliane saying the sight is out of this world. We spent almost 2 hours up there, a long time without oxygen. I had almost reached camp at 25,000 feet when I couldn't help turning around again to look back at the summit. Way up there, I saw Liliane and Maurice back in the bottleneck. I wondered why they were proceeding so leisurely with that long descent ahead of them. At this point, I had no way of knowing that this would be the last time I would see my friends.
Wanda Rukiewicz did make the first female ascent of K2, which was, you know, a terrific achievement. The trick to remember is when you get to the top, you're halfway, not 9/10 of the way, which is very tempting to think. But the Berards, they pushed it too hard, I think, for too long. The mistake always is knowing when to turn round.
The losses mount. Liliane Berard's body is discovered at the foot of a 3,000-meter precipice. Maurice is never found. As the month turns, another 10 climbers reach summit. But of those who succeed, 2 succumb to unusual falls for climbers of their ability and perish.
I remember saying at one point it was like reading a really badly written novel, because anything you could possibly imagine happening did.
Meanwhile, on the northwest route, the British team struggles with an onslaught of storms, frustrating their ability to advance.
Every time we set off, you know, we'd think we'd hit it right. And every time we got to anywhere near the high point, we'd get it wrong again, and the weather would close in. And we really weren't making very much progress at all. We've got to allow about a week from base camp to base camp. And if you weren't careful, you could just keep getting it wrong, and we did.
Sustained ice climbing on the expansive ridge requires over 16,000 feet of fixed rope, a team-oriented style of mountaineering not favored by Alan Rouse's assembly of maverick climbing stars.
We were forced to adopt a traditional fixed rope expedition than an alpine-style lightweight push. Comparatively unknown climbers were actually managing to get up the Abruzzi Ridge, and we were still mucking around sort of less than halfway out on our route, which is much harder and much more remote.
By mid-July, after 2 months of being defeated by bad weather and 6 deaths on the mountain, the British team decides to end their expedition. That is, all but 2 of its members, Al Rouse and Jim Curran.
For Al Rouse, his burning ambition was to climb K2. He'd already been there twice and failed each time. He said he really wanted to have one last go, so I stayed on as well. And Al teamed up with a Polish climber, Marywka Wolf, and they made one last push on the Abruzzi Ridge.
Only 16 of the original 39 climbers remain on K2. Having been unable to penetrate the north face, Al Rouse now seizes an opportunity to join a final attempt up the Abruzzi Ridge. Jim Curran is to stay at base camp, relaying radio messages between all of those refusing to give up the mountain. He interviews Al about his decision to stay on.
I need climbing now as part of my life. If I don't climb, life seems empty. I suppose the problem is, in the end, it's addictive. And for some people, it's a fatal addiction.
It is only midsummer on K2, and already 6 deaths have occurred on Expedition 86, more than in any other season in the history of this infamous mountain. Unable to abandon his dream of the summit, Al Rouse teams up with Marifka Wolf, a survivor from the Polish team, in a final attempt on the Abruzzi Ridge. Curran agrees to remain at base camp to relay messages between all 16 climbers remaining on the mountain. He also keeps audio, video, and written diaries of events as they unfold. We ask him to revisit those diaries.
1st of August, and it is a most beautiful and stunningly clear day.
It's the evening of August the 2nd. I've heard that Al Rouse and Marifka have reached Camp 4, along with Kurt Dienberger and Julie Tullis. So with a bit of luck, they should all top out tomorrow.
Reaching Camp 4, or final camp on the shoulder, is a milestone. Just 1 day's climb from the summit. But at almost 25,000 feet, the remaining bottleneck is no ordinary challenge, historically exacting a deep human toll. As climbers make their way above 26,000 feet, the lethal patterns of the K2 summit appear to be closing in.
Today is Sunday the 3rd of August, and today is D-Day. The tension is absolutely unbearable. The weather is certainly not good.
The following morning I was woken up by the Pakistani liaison officer who told me that one of the Polish climbers had died on the way down from the summit of K2, and I was waiting for the call to finish and then say, leave your radios actually at Camp 4 for Kurt and Al and Julie, and it was a split second too late, and so there was no more radio contact with the climbers at Camp 4.
Jim Curran waits without contact while at Camp 4. Alan Rouse, Marifka Wolf, Billy Bauer, Kurt Dienberger, and Julie Tullis huddle in their tent, trapped in the death zone by a violent storm.
And I've woken up to at least 3 inches of snow. Anyone on K2 now will be fighting desperately for their lives. Alan, Marifka are now on the mountain on their 6th day, have reluctantly accepted that has been a dreadful disaster. Now they've been gone for 12 days, all hope is gone. And it clearly isn't worth it. More people have died than have reached the summit.
Despairing for the loss of his friends, Curran then witnesses the impossible.
And we looked out, the strip of moraine goes to a definite vanishing point, and right in the middle of the vanishing point there was this little dark shape, and we all rushed out, and it was Billy Bauer. We established that Kurt Dienberger was somewhere behind, and he just looked at me and he said, I've lost Julie. And I realized that there was no way that Al was going to come down. Kurt said that he was virtually dead when they left him. And Marifka, his climbing partner, had also got lost on the way down.
On the 3rd day of the storm, Julie Tullis died in her tent as a result of the prolonged stay at extreme altitude. 3 days later, Alan Rouse, delirious and incapacitated, began losing his struggle for survival. During a brief respite from the storm, Kurt, Billy, and Marifka began their descent, forced to leave Al behind to die.
Every time I've been away on an expedition, when I get back to England, I feel completely rejuvenated, batteries recharged. So great to just go in, turn the tap on and have water instead of waiting for hours to melt the snow. All these little luxuries, and life itself takes on a new meaning.
They ran out of water at Camp 4, and I mean, Al was sort of last seen, you know, pleading for water. It's almost a very sort of prophetic thing to say. It's hard listening.
Curran learned that the leader of his expedition did attain at least one enduring wish.
About 2 or 3 days later, Kurt told me that Al actually had got to the summit of K2, and I'd sort of somehow got it into my head that he hadn't. So, wasn't much consolation, but, you know, at least a little bit.
Alan Rouse was the first British climber to summit K2. By the end of summer 1986, 13 lives have been lost on K2, more than in the entire history of the mountain, and the highest death toll in the Himalaya in any previous season. Yet despite its dark notoriety, the world's greatest climbers will not stay away from K2.
It was like the mountain was gesturing to us, like, come on, and I'll get you too. I mean, it makes me shudder now to think of it.
I did think about 86, I must admit, and Al was a good friend of mine. I knew it wouldn't put me off climbing. I did feel nauseous for a while. I did feel like I didn't want to go to the mountains, not the big mountains, for a while.
It will be 4 years after the tragic events of '86 before another climber makes it to the top of K2. But once that watershed is passed, others follow. From 1990 to the beginning of 1995, 47 climbers make it to K2's peak at a cost of 5 lives. Mortality rates of just over 10% would be unthinkable in any other endeavor. But to climbers, it's an acceptable risk on a mountain with K2's singular status.
It's just remarkably sort of inspiring and alluring if you're a mountain climber. You just want to climb it. It's the first prize in mountaineering and, dare I say, possibly the hardest mountain in the world. I dedicated 3 years of my life to climbing it, really. I tried it 3 consecutive years before I summited.
In 1995, almost a full decade after K2's deadliest season, Alan Hinks climbs and conquers the mountain. But even in his euphoria, the specter of '86 is never far from mind.
Where Al Rouse and Julie Tullis perished. You stay here too long, you'll die. It's too high, it's in the death zone. If you get trapped here in a storm, you've had it.
But I was absolutely wiped out when I got to the shoulder. It would have been physically and mentally difficult for me to push on any further. I didn't leave it straight away. I got back there about 10 at night, and I stayed there till about 5 or 6 the following morning. I felt I just wanted to be there on the shoulder, and I just felt things were going to be okay. I was lying in my tent, and I just thought, I've finally done it, but I was so exhausted, I'll never forget. I really had sensory deprivation. I was lying in my tent at base camp in the dark, and I just couldn't feel my clothes or my sleeping bag or anything. I just felt I was suspended in a black pit.
Despite his hypoxic symptoms, Hinks ultimately does manage to leave the death zone. During his descent the following day, he encounters English climber Alison Hargraves, who had been trailing behind him throughout her ascent.
So Alison, she congratulated me and then she burst into tears. You could see that the mountain had socked in, the summit was engulfed in a lenticular cloud, which would be high winds and snow. I left a tent for them on the shoulder and I carried on down to base camp, and then the next day they came down to base camp as well. They couldn't get the mountain on that go, And we spent a bit of time together, about a week in base camp. And I just thought, I'm going home. I need to get back, see my daughter, see friends.
How does that affect you, that I'm going and you're still here? You're going to have to go up to the top tomorrow or the day after.
It'll be nice and quiet. So obviously it's very difficult to know, because if we set off too early, we'll mentally blow ourselves. If we set off a day late, we could miss the summit by, another storm coming in, so it's really difficult to know. It's just judging it right.
While Alison contemplates K2 and its formidable odds, Alan Hinks departs the mountain with a rare and ineffable prize. He's conquered K2. But the mountain is about to draw a prize of its own. During the 3rd week of July, Peter Hillary arrives in Islamabad. Late July in the summer of 1995, renowned New Zealand mountaineer Peter Hillary meets his Canadian climbing partner Jeff Lakes on K2. At base camp, they find Alison Hargraves and Rob Slater, still waiting for the right break in weather to re-attempt the summit. 4 weeks after Alan Hinks' successful journey, the two teams gather forces to make their own push to the top.
We had started to collaborate with the American team, which was basically just Rob Slater from the States and Alison Hargraves from the UK. We moved up quite quickly. We sort of stopped at 24,000 feet at the top of the Black Pyramid, and then out we went into the night. At about 11 p.m., Jeff Lakes and I left the camp and went back up onto the shoulder, and that's when we actually started our summit attempt. We got up towards the bottleneck, and actually Jeff and I were absolutely frozen. It was really cold, so we actually dropped down. I saw Alison, and she just said, "I'm going on." Jeff and I had warmed up a little. We decided to keep going, and we got up into the base of the bottleneck, and I told Jeff that I just felt it was late in the day. I just didn't like it. It was quite an intuitive feeling. At that point, Alison Hargraves called down, "Come on up, use the red rope." Jeff said, look, he'd have to go on a bit because he said he'd kick himself if they got up and he missed out. Rather egotistically, I even thought, what am I going to feel like if they come down and go, wow, you know, we're up there on the summit, it was fantastic, why weren't you up there, Peter? But I just decided to stick to my guns. Not long after the clouds started coming in, then I just started the descent down these vast snow slopes, and really it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. And at times I wouldn't know where I was, whether I was drifting out to the south face, the east face, which is no return country. I couldn't see anything, the wind's getting stronger. And then I got down to the top of the Black Pyramid, and I clipped into the rope. I rappelled 10, 15 feet, and the storm came in. I was just thrown around. It just screamed on for most of the night. I didn't even really think about the others or anyone else. I was in survival mode. It must have been about 7:30 at night, and it was quite dark. I arrived at our Camp 2, and the tents were just shaking. I fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, it was just a beautiful day. Then later in the day, to our amazement, there was a radio call from Jeff. He had survived the night. He had lost all his equipment, his crampons, his ice axe, his harness, everything. He was badly dehydrated. He was exhausted. He was slurring his words. Jeff came down the Black Pyramid, 2,000 feet of very steep mixed rock and ice with these overhangs, hand over hand. As soon as I saw him, I knew things weren't good with Jeff. He was sort of like a ghost, really. But even then, I felt we could pour liquids into him, and the next morning I thought we'd all be fine and we'd wrap off the mountain, but that wasn't to be.
On August 13th, Canadian climber Jeff Lakes dies in his sleep from exhaustion and acute mountain illness.
The 6 others climbed on, and we know for sure that maybe all of them, but certainly some of them, reached the summit. We hoped that we'd hear, you know, the sound of the clanking of people rappelling down ropes and their gear clanking away, but, you know, that wasn't to happen, and I don't think any of us really felt that after that storm that was particularly likely.
No one knows for sure how the other 6 climbers lost their lives. Most likely, winds in excess of 100 miles per hour blew them to their deaths.
I think in retrospect, the most important thing that my father taught me about mountains was to be able to make your own decisions in the face of a lot of pressure, both the pressure of difficult circumstances on the mountain, terrible weather, or, you know, maybe you're even being pushed with your own skills, but more importantly, when other people are making different decisions from what you feel you should make for yourself.
It was more than upsetting, you know. I'd known Alison a long time, and I was pretty upset, to say the least. I could just feel there was a tragedy unfolding, really. People were just too determined, just focusing on the summit, prepared to take any sort of risk, really. But it was just like, well, this is just K2, you know, it's just another big mountain. And it isn't. You really have got to treat it like something special, you know.